only a few days ago, joining me on this programme, you said, and you said it as if you would brook no discussion, as if there were no other view, as if there were no other option. This money must be returned. It must and should be returned. It ought to be returned. And I think you thought that it was such an obvious conclusion that it would be returned. So what do you make of all the obfuscating that's happened since?
Well, I think the fact that it's £15 million and not £10 million may be right, that why they've been even slower in returning it than they should have been. I mean, the fact that Conservatives won't confirm the second 5 million is really confirmation in itself. I mean, otherwise they just simply say that story's complete rubbish, forget it. I mean, the problem the party has with this money is that they need it. The Conservative Party is much more dependent on money for its election campaigns than Labour. Labour have got a lot more volunteers, a lot more party members. They're a lot younger than the Conservative Party. The Conservatives are really short of people to go out on the doorsteps, make contact with voters, deliver leaflets and so on. And a lot of the time these days, the Conservatives need to use agencies to do phone banking and to deliver leaflets. And agencies cost money. The money doesn't go on billboards much these days or big advertisements in the newspapers. That's the sort of thing the money goes on.
I mean, I wouldn't normally deal in such vulgar conversational topics, but is there any place at all, Michael, to mention Rishi Sunak's own immense personal fortune, or indeed his wife's voluminous personal fortune, in the light of which a mere £10 million really signifies little more than chicken feed, does it?
I suppose you're right, really. And indeed, maybe Rishi Sunak or Mrs. Sunak should make up the shortfall. I mean, they're going to find it difficult to make up the shortfall if the Sunaks don't contribute. And it would look very odd, by the way, if they did. I mean, I think that's just a bit of a laugh. But the problem the Tories have right now is they will have squeezed all the donors. In the current climate, people are not going to be very inclined to give large sums of money to the Conservative Party when it looks like they're going to lose. And they particularly won't be inclined to give money to the Conservatives if they think that they're just making up for the fact that the Conservatives have had to give £15 million back to Mr. Hester. So they really are stuck in a way. And the other problem the Conservatives have got right now is a lot of wealthy Tory donors are also the kind of people who are inclined from time to time to give money to Reform UK or the Brexit Party or its many different guises, UKIP and the Referendum Party. And so they're going to find it very difficult to get another 10 or 15 million pounds to make up for this shortfall, even though in terms of Sunak's own wealth, in terms of the amount of money the Americans spend on their elections, these sums are tiny.
Let me bring Aubrey into this. Aubrey, at the Times, obviously you're in close contact every minute of the day with your delightful and discerning readers. You know how they're responding to each news story. What are readers of the Times thinking about this money? Did they think, as Michael thinks, it's absolutely obvious, done and dusted, it's a given, the money should be returned, and therefore are expecting it to be returned? Or do they think in the same way as Rishi Sunak, quite interestingly, in my view, that Hester has shown remorse, and remorse is fine, so you just bank the remorse, you bank the money, there's no need at all to give the money back and nothing to see here? What are your readers thinking?
I think people are quite confused, really, about Number 10's initial stance here and why it took them so long to call out these comments as misogynistic and racist. And therefore, I think people feel as though, you know, it's almost like there was a sort of resistance to wanting to truly stand up to this, and a dissonance, really, between Rishi Sunak's approach to this issue and what he'd been saying very loudly in his first speech on the steps of Downing Street in months, when he was talking about the need for better political discourse and to sort of clamp down on extremist views. So I think that's where the Conservative Party is in most danger. And I think Michael was making some good points there about why it's getting harder and harder to sort of attract donors to the Conservative Party, not least because if they look to be going into sort of exile, then money buys you less and less influence. I think another thing that will be at the back of donors' minds is that they don't necessarily need to be contributing to the Conservative Party, but potential future leadership candidates who themselves are looking to sort of bolster the coffers of their own potential future campaigns to replace Rishi Sunak.
And Michael, the longer this draws out, this kind of conversation or this kind of altercation about whether the money should be given back, does that mean that if it in the end is given back, all the good that people imagine will have been achieved by giving it back is cancelled and negated by the fact that it's taken so damn long?
Yeah, the later they give it back, the worse it gets. And if they carry on like this, then we're going to have another row at the time that the Electoral Commission, which frankly is a pretty useless regulator on these matters, when the Electoral Commission finally get round to publishing the donations for the Conservative Party in a few weeks' time, Aubrey probably knows the exact date, then there'll be another row about it. And then at regular intervals, Labour will bring this up and the Liberal Democrats and the SNP, all their opponents will bring this story up during the course of the long election campaign. But on the Electoral Commission, I mean, the rule should be as soon as somebody gives a large donation, maybe above £100,000 or something, that has to be published within a week, because often it's relevant at the time it's given and it's less relevant 3 months down the road. And indeed, that is what happens during the election, the 6 weeks of the election campaign itself, that donations are announced. I think it's every week. Well, why can't we have them announced every week now, 7 or 8 months before the formal election campaign, instead of waiting for all this time? I mean, it's just it's like something out of the 19th century, the slowness with which the Electoral Commission works, particularly in this era where everything's digital. It's pathetic. They ought to be ashamed of themselves. And I know they're probably working under rules laid down by Parliament, but Parliament should be ashamed of themselves for setting up those rules in the first place, which were presumably, when they did so, they did it to reduce the level of scrutiny and transparency.
Aubrey, do we know whether the rules prohibit Rishi Sunak reaching into his back pocket or down the side of one of his sofas and just forking out 10 mil of his own money? I mean, we know that his fortune runs to hundreds of millions, if not billions. We know that his wife's fortune similarly is almost limitless, quite frankly. He could easily sub it in himself. Is he allowed to?
It would be perfectly possible for the Prime Minister to sort of contribute. And in fact, there was the slightly bizarre revelation in the last few weeks that I think the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, had donated up to around £100,000 of his own money to his own Conservative association to sort of boost their coffers and help with the sort of party campaigning machine and apparatus in Surrey. So there's certainly sort of precedent for it. But I suspect that the Prime Minister wouldn't want to sort of fill in and fill that breach himself, and would rather sort of turn this into a bit of an issue for all parties. The Labour Party has been accused of taking donations from other potentially unsavoury characters before, and they said after that was pointed out, they stopped taking money from them. But it sort of reminds me of an episode from The Thick of It, where I think Malcolm Tucker and the other Tory spin doctor, Stuart Pearson, are talking about donors, and they say it doesn't really benefit one side to talk about dodgy donors because sort of all parties become embroiled in it. And I suppose there's a danger, if you like, that for political opponents to try and press this bruise too hard, that there might be sort of potential future implications. Might they have to hand back other sort of £1 million donations for people who they don't know have said something unsavoury, rude, racist, misogynistic? That's, I suppose, the question for the opposition parties.
Let me ask Michael about the various other kind of permutations of this controversy over the Hester donation. And one of them is that it is now becoming a kind of perfectly kind of normal thing for people to say and to call for and clamour for, which is give Diane Abbott back the Labour whip. As if there's a conflation and association between the horrifying comments that Frank Hester made about her, which somehow cancels out and absolves Diane Abbott of the comments that she made in a letter that she wrote to The Observer, which the essence of which was that Jewish people, traveller families and Irish people don't experience racism. They might experience prejudice, but they don't experience racism. And for that reason, the whip was removed. It's as if, she has now been racially and misogynistically insulted. Therefore, that cancels out whatever she said and whoever she offended, and therefore give her back the whip. And I wonder what you make of that, whether you think there's a kind of lack of Socratic coherence in concluding one thing as a result of the other.
Yeah, I agree with you entirely on that. I think the fact that Diane Abbott has herself been wronged doesn't make up for the wrongs that she's committed. However, I do think that if you take Diane, I mean, there were utterly appalling remarks that she made in that letter to the Observer. But I think if you take her career as a whole, I think that Starmer has been mean-spirited and frankly hypocritical on a vast scale in the way he's treated Diane Abbott and Jeremy round the cabinet table and tell the world what wonderful people they were. And as soon as he gets into power, he ditches them and does all he can to make sure that they're not standing as candidates. So I think he should restore the whip to Diane Abbott, not because of the Frank Hester episode, and despite the appalling nature of her remarks in The Observer. I think you've got to take her, her 35-year career as the first black woman MP, and she should have the whip restored, as indeed should several of the other left-wing MPs who've been left in limbo and don't really know where they stand. I'm not saying all of them should have the whip restored, but I think the way in which Labour have really set out to annihilate the left has been utterly unsavoury, given the way in which Starmer was right there in the thick of it, round Corbyn's shadow cabinet table, and was one of the first people to return to the shadow cabinet, having resigned at an earlier stage. So, it's complicated, but those are my views.
It is complicated. There's interesting views. I wonder whether Aubrey agrees. Should Diane Abbott get the whip back? And if she does, is it because she's been so deeply vilified and hugely insulted by Frank Hester that she needs kind of to get the whip as compensation, a consolation prize for having been so very badly and ill-used and badly treated? Or is it because she actually deserves to get it back?
There's certainly a concerted campaign by some of her supporters, particularly on the left, who have really sort of kept their heads down and I suppose felt very worried that they would be kicked out of the Labour Party for whatever excuse could be found. But obviously, she did make some very sort of serious comments, basically suggesting that Jewish people sort of didn't experience their racism their whole lives in the way that essentially black people did. And I think the sort of argument that carries most weight is that the system for investigating complaints like this is incredibly opaque. She made those comments in April last year and is still being investigated now. So 11 months on, how much is there to investigate? Or is the Labour Party sort of dragging its feet and waiting for a politically expedient moment to readmit her or disbar her from standing at the next election? And is that really the way that they should be treating a Labour MP of 35 years?
And Michael, the other question hanging over all of this, there are so many actually, is the conduct, or the lack of conduct, I suppose you might say, of the Speaker, Sir Lindsay Hoyle. We now know that Diane Abbott tried to speak in a debate that pertained very largely to herself. No fewer than, I think, 46 times she tried to get his attention. We also know, because we've had to establish this on my programme, for people who might not realise, that actually there is form in the Speaker accepting a comment from somebody who isn't on the list or the roster. It happens a lot. It's not a shocking, revolutionary thing. And he ignored her 46 times in a debate about a hideous, racist slur being cast upon her, culminating in Frank Hester saying he thought she should be shot. I mean, it couldn't get much worse, really, could it? So do you think there should be any censure of the Speaker for treating her in that way?
Well, maybe censure will be going too far. And of course, he's been under a lot of pressure recently after all the shenanigans of a couple of weeks ago and the SNP motion and all of that. I forget the details now. But it is appalling the way he didn't call Diane Abbott to ask a question. So I wouldn't say it's censure, but I think he's sort of, if he's not careful, he's going to be on sort of probation and is going to have to improve his act, because I think a lot of people on all sides of the House were appalled by that. It was a bad misjudgment. And I don't think you could, I mean, maybe he argues, well, she's not a Labour MP anymore. She hasn't got the whip anymore. But, independent MPs are entitled to speak and entitled to be called as well. It was a very bad misjudgment, I think, by Lindsay Hoyle, who up till a couple of weeks ago, actually, I think has been a pretty good speaker. But he's lost it in the last couple
Yeah,
of
it
weeks.
looks like he might have lost confidence, lost direction, lost some kind of equilibrium in all of this, Aubrey, because it really did look like, I mean, not merely bad form and not merely discourteous, it really looked as if it was underlining a kind of atmosphere in which a black woman, however distinguished, however long of service, however badly insulted and treated, can then be marginalised in the conversation about that actual issue and event. It really was absolutely, I know it's a vulgar term, gobsmacking. It was absolutely extraordinary that he didn't call on her when she tried so many times to speak. Do you think that he needs to be locked in that room again with Keir Starmer and given a good dressing down, or whatever Keir Starmer did to him last week to get him to, you know, do whatever he did to the thing that Michael's just forgotten and is far too boring to recall? But don't you think so?
There was pressure basically put on the Speaker to accept a Labour amendment which wasn't in order and against the advice of his clerks. That was the issue we were all talking about a few weeks ago. When it comes to this one, I had both Labour and Conservative MPs coming up to me afterwards and saying they thought it was really unacceptable, and proof, if you like, that the Speaker sort of couldn't stand up for himself and do what he thought was right. Because in the case of a few weeks ago, you basically had a Speaker who was accused of not standing up for a minority party, the SNP, and this week you have the Speaker accused of not standing up for minority MPs. And in this instance, I mean, you know, independent MPs, Diane Abbott, it doesn't have the Labour whip. Independents are still a sort of powerful voice in Parliament. They are still their MPs, the people who have, you know, elected them. They still have a right to have a voice. And particularly in this debate about racism and misogyny, it felt very strange that it was basically conducted entirely by, you know, white sort of men usually, and the sort of black woman who was being spoken about was not allowed to speak for herself. I think there is a process in Parliament whereby people are allowed to make a personal statement. Normally that's after they resign some sort of senior position, but I wonder if Diane Abbott might put in a request for that, because so far she hasn't been able to have her say in all this.